Welcome to the People's Palestine University Online, an initiative by the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, coalition of individuals and organizations committed to educate the public on the 1948 Nakba of Palestine and the ongoing Nakba since 1948. This is our second episode, which we call Minisodes in this series. My name is Professor Ilan Pape, and I'm very honored to deliver the second episode titled The Impact of Zionism. Zionism was born out of probably four impulses. Each one of them eventually created the movement and turned the movement into a powerful factor that changed dramatically the place called Palestine, the region around it, and in some cases even had far-reaching implications on the situation in other parts of the world. The first impulse was a Jewish, mainly a Jewish European response to the rise of a new kind of anti-Jewishness, or what most historians would call anti-Semitism, although there is always a problem with this term anti-Semitism, because the Jews of Europe were not Semites. But of course, we understand that this is now the common reference to the hatred of the Jews because of who they are throughout the centuries, especially in the West. So with a rise of new kind of hatred towards Jews, triggered by the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. The rise of nationalism brought with it a wish to define more clearly the new nations of Europe. And in the definition of who is a new nation in Europe, there was also a kind of an impulse to define who is not part of the new nations. And the Jews were an easy prey in this respect. So this kind of attraction of nationalism to so many people and the born of new nations in Europe was accompanied by particularly vicious wave of racism through legislation, pogroms, and persecution of all kinds against the Jews who particularly lived in Central and Eastern Europe. And there was a search among Jewish communities of how to face this new wave of anti-Semitism. And one of the responses, by no means the only one, but one of the responses was to look for a way of saving Jews from a continued persecution and eventually, as we know, genocide in the case of many Jews in the Second World War, was to try and build for them a safe haven outside of Europe in Palestine. So this was the first impulse. The second impulse came even before the rise of nationalism in Europe in the 19th century and was a theological one. It was driven by certain denominations in evangelical Christianity that saw the transfer of the Jews from not only from Europe, but also from the United States to Palestine as part of a divine scheme that would include eventually the resurrection of the dead, the return of the Messiah, and the beginning of Jesus Christ's reign on earth. And therefore, they thought that by persuading Jews to leave the West, and especially Europe and the United States, to Palestine, that would precipitate the process that eventually would lead to the end of times as they saw it. Now, the people who believed in it and became very active already at the beginning of the 19th century were very important people. Some of them were presidents of the United States. Others held very senior position in the British government or headed some important clerical institution in Germany. So this was not just a position of some intellectuals. It was a position taken by people who carried political weight and were pushing for this idea of what they would call the return of the Jews to the Holy Land. The third impulse was imperialist. and it was driven mainly by the British Empire. Quite surprising in a way, because Britain already in the 19th century ruled much of the world, and yet there was always appetite for more territory, for more influence. And there was a lobby within the British policy-making elite that wished to annex to Britain some of the Ottoman provinces, especially those of the Levant, and in particular Palestine, in order to strengthen the British influence both in the Middle East, but also, or the West Asia, but also because they saw the area as an important land bridge, and after the excavation of the Suez Canal, even a maritime bridge between Britain and its jewel in the crown, the colony, as they would see it, or the Raj of India. So imperialist lobbyists in Britain pushed also for the idea of a Jewish resurrection, if you want, in Palestine, and supported the Zionist movement. The last impulse was also came from Jewish intellectuals who, in a way, internalized the racist ideas about Judaism that were at the core of the wave of anti-Semitism in the mid-19th century. Namely, they accepted the allegation that actually the Jews were not Europeans, that they were a different race, that therefore a different nation, and they were not Poles, they were not French, they were not German, and they needed to find a homeland for Judaism as nationalism, not as a religion. So they redefined Judaism as nationalism, and were adopting the same kind of romantic nationalist ideologies that other European groups adopted, but they honed on Palestine because of the biblical connection between Judaism and through the Old Testament to Palestine, as the natural place to build the homeland. So what happened was that you had these theological, imperialist, intellectual, ideological impulses from Jews and non-Jews that eventually created a movement that I would say became more powerful at the beginning of the 20th century, and turned an idea that was scholastic, theological, and ideological into a proper imperialist and colonialist project. In the literature, we call such a project a settler colonial project. It was not that different from other settler colonial projects, namely projects that pushed Europeans out of Europe because they were not welcome for economic, theological, cultural reasons, and with the help of empires, colonized places outside of Europe with the help of the empire, but eventually rebelling against the empire and creating their own national identity in places such as Australia, New Zealand, North America, of course, both Canada and the United States, and many of the states that we're familiar with today in Central and South America. And the Zionist project was not different in that respect. It was also a settler colonial movement, a bit later in terms of historical timing, but with the similar features of settler colonial projects. And the features are important to be mentioned once more. First of all, you have a group that is unwelcome in Europe. Secondly, you have a group that wants to rebuild for itself a Europe instead of the Europe that didn't want it. Thirdly, it's a group that needs an empire to put a foothold in someone else's homeland or country. Fourthly, and probably most importantly, all the settler colonial movements chose places where other people already lived. You can call them the indigenous people. And as the late great Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe has put it, there was always an impulse among the settlers to view the indigenous people, the native people, as the main obstacle for the success of their projects. And therefore, eliminating the natives was part and parcel of all the settler colonial projects, including the Zionists. Elimination in the case of Palestine took form through ethnic cleansing, but as we know, eventually ethnic cleansing can easily develop also into genocidal policy. There was also another feature of settler colonialism: the settlers appropriate part of the traditions, the history, and some of the cultural heritage of the indigenous people and appropriate it as if it was their own. And by that add to the erasure of the indigenous identity of the place that they have colonized. And I mentioned also before, once the settler colonial project feels it is solid enough, it rebels against the empire because it doesn't want to be part of the empire that helped it to exist. And it fights on both fronts, against the empire and against the indigenous people. And that's what Zionism did. Now, the early impact of Zionism on Palestine was in two very important aspects. First of all, like all settler colonial movements, Zionism needed land to build colonies, to build space for the settlers. Now, Zionist impact was felt the moment Britain occupied Palestine in 1918, because up to the occupation of Palestine, when Palestine was still part of the Ottoman Empire, it was very difficult for the Zionist movement to purchase land. It was even more difficult after purchasing land to remove the indigenous people who lived on the land. It became possible once Britain became the law and order in Palestine, and Britain ruled Palestine between 1918 to 1948. And through its own ideas of land ownership and land regime, it did not only allow the Zionist movement to buy significant plots of land in Palestine, it also allowed it to deviate from a custom that was 100 or 150 years old in the Ottoman Empire, that even if land ownership of a huge piece of land is transferred from one person to the other, the villages on these lands stay as they are. The land ownership changes, but the tenants are do not remove. They may pay taxes now to a different authority, but as they had been there for centuries, they will continue. That was the idea of the Ottomans. They will continue to be there for centuries. The British and the Zionists had a different idea. Once the Zionist movement bought land, and the first significant purchase of land was in the 1920s, then the villages on the land had to be removed for the sake of the new settlers, the Zionist settlers. So we have the first wave of ethnic cleansing of about 13 Palestinian villages in the 1920s, and that's the first impact Palestinians feel, because up to that moment, the impact could not be felt by Palestinians because all they saw was very poor Jews coming from Europe, and most of them were even welcomed by the Palestinians, giving them, according to the traditional hospitality, a place to live in, taught them how to cultivate the land because Jews were not allowed to cultivate land in Europe and had to relearn it. But once the land purchase, land to transfer of people, the impact began to